Good evening, everyone, and on behalf of our parish priest, Father Stephen, and members of my colleagues in the Pastoral Council, I want to welcome you all to our first of our talks for the new season. I'm very pleased on your behalf to welcome Fr Thomas McGlynn from St Malachy's Parish at the Marcus, whom you might know, but he's given me a short biography here, which I'll read for you now. Father Thomas is a native of Rosetta, Knockbreda, and the original Holy Rosary Church, where he was baptised. He went to school at St Bernard's Primary School and then to St Augustine's and St Patrick's Knock before entering seminary in 1985 in the wing at St Malachy's College, and he attended Queen's University Belfast to do scholastic philosophy, ancient history and Byzantine studies. In 1989 he went on then to the Irish College in Rome for theology and was ordained on June the 27th, 1993 in St Bernadette's Church. He was then appointed curate to St Paul's, followed by the Holy Trinity Parish, and then became chaplain to the RVH, the Dominican and Adoration Convents. In 2014, Father Thomas became parish priest in St Agnes's and then came to St Malachy's in 2022. As an altar boy for Canon George O'Hanlon, who was curate in St Bernadette's, he had his first introduction to the archival material he was gathering. Surprisingly, there was no diocesan archives in Down and Connor then, until this began, and he began this task. Now, under the then Bishop Daly, our diocesan archives were formally established to store this material and what has been gathered since. Shortly after his ordination, Father Thomas then was asked to assist in the archives, and following Canon O'Hagan's death, he became the archivist. He has always enjoyed history and has a special interest in architecture of all periods, but especially the Gothic revival and its greatest proponent, Pugin. So, with that brief introduction, Father, I would like to welcome you again, and we look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. They always say you should never start off with an apology, but I'm going to do that anyway. I should just make it clear, I am not a scholar and I'm not a formal historian, but yes, as those notes certainly indicate, I do have a great love of history, and some of that obviously was through that time with Queen, so the ancient history and the Byzantine, but I'm not actually a formal historian, but I am the diocesan archivist, and I have a great interest in our local history, which Canon O'Hanlon very, very generously passed on to me when he was our curate in St Bernadette's. I remember seeing the archive start with one or two filing cabinets at the bottom of the stairs in the parochial house, and the one or two became 4 or 5, and the 4 or 5 became about a dozen. And then when Bishop Cahill Daly was appointed to Down and Connor, he was surprised that there were no archives, and he set them up. And one of my tasks was also relocating them. They used to be located then at the Bishop's house, and they're now located 120 Cliftonville Road in the old Poor Clare Convent. So I'm trying to keep them up to date in the midst of parochial duties, which isn't an easy task. But I was very pleased when Father Stephen asked me to do this evening and just share a little bit then of something of the, I hope you will discover, incredible history of this parish. So I think probably the first thing I would just like to note that I think it's good maybe this evening on this series of talks to celebrate your 150th anniversary, I think to take a much wider and a much broader historical perspective, and I think I'd like just really to formally begin with a statistical observation. There's been a Christian presence in this part of County Down, basically Newtownards, Bangor, Holywood, for 1,500 years. Now that's a remarkable history and heritage. On this site here, just outside the town, beside My Lady's Mile, there has been a Catholic church standing for 150 years. And that, of course, is 10% of that 1,500-year history. And I'm sure you'd agree with me this evening, 10% of anything is still something quite significant. I always think it's just how you sometimes look at statistics, because sometimes we just pick these numbers, 150 years, 1,500 years. But when you remind yourselves that this parish alone has been here for 10% of the documented Christian history and heritage of this particular region in County Down. It also, that 150 years, takes us across at least 6 generations of parishioners. And some of you here today maybe are a second or a third generation, or maybe even some of you perhaps could maybe trace your family roots back to pretty much the very first church, and maybe even a little bit beyond that when this church opened in 1874. It certainly also takes us across 3 centuries, the 19th, the 20th and the 21st. And when you spread something over 3 centuries, 150 years can be over 2 centuries. But just as they've fallen in your particular case, I think it's also interesting to remind yourselves that this church and this presence takes us over 3 separate centuries. A further reminder of just how far this site and this community goes back in time. Now, that's some of the established facts that I can maybe share with you this evening. But we know that ancient history going back 1,500 years, early Irish history, like so much of it in Europe, but particularly here in this country, it's rather sparsely and indeed poorly recorded and documented. There's different reasons for that, of course. I think maybe part of it is that the Romans never reached here. We always seem to be a bit behind the times in this part of the world, don't we? If things happen in other places, good or bad, it takes us sometimes just a little bit longer to catch up in other directions. The absence of those sources, of course, probably wasn't helped by what happened in Dublin just after the partition of Ireland, with the destruction of so many vital historical documents and records that went up in flames. That was basically an irreparable loss, and it is something I think that all historians of Irish history and indeed European history will also very much still feel to this day. So we at least do know, whatever, that we can take ourselves back about 1,500 years. In this diocese of Down and Conor in particular, we have very strong connections with St Patrick from both eras of his life, when he came unwillingly the first time as a captive in Slemish, when he came back the second time, maybe even then slightly unwillingly, but certainly he came with a very definite mandate, and that was to bring Christianity to our ancestors. And the key date, of course, in that story is the one that most historians seem pretty much to agree on, and they pin it usually by the year 432, the year that St Patrick formally arrived to commence that mission and that ministry to bring Christianity. Although it's also generally accepted that while Patrick maybe gets most of the credit, there probably was a small Christian presence somewhere here in Ireland, and of course the person who usually gets that particular credit is Palladius. Some also say that the names Patrick, Palladius have been mixed up, and some have said were there 2 Patricks, but generally the consensus seems to be that there was almost certainly somebody called Palladius, but we know that Patrick certainly formally came here in the year 432. The Romans, of course, didn't know or knew that this island existed, but they didn't actually conquer it. But there was certainly probably some informal connections between Ireland and its near neighbour in Britain, and that was certainly a very personal connection for St Patrick when he first came, albeit as a slave. What we do know is certainly by the 6th century, things start becoming a little bit more certain. We know that by the 6th century, the faith was well established in different parts of Ireland, but particularly here in this part of County Down, just looking over the shores of Belfast Lough, right also down the Ards Peninsula as well, in the towns and places that I've already mentioned, Bangor, Newton Ards, and of course where we are gathered here this evening in Holywood. Bangor, of course, is not only just a name for town, but for historians and particularly church historians, it has a particular significance as the place where one of the greatest abbeys in Ireland and certainly in Europe as well was founded by St Colmcille in the year 558. That monastery, even in its own time and its own day, just shortly after its foundation, was widely known and celebrated, particularly also for some of the very distinguished monks and scholars that came from that monastery, and most famously, of course, St Columbanus, whom are late and still much lamented and greatly loved former Bishop Noel Traynor, may he rest in peace, was such a great proponent of Columbanus, was always very much presenting his cause, particularly maybe just as we in Europe are losing our faith, and to rediscover this man who was so central to the European story, and particularly to the story of the faith in Europe. And as Pope Benedict remarked a few years ago, in one of his audiences when he was still Pope, he made a reference to Columbanus, was particularly captivated by the fact that Columbanus gives probably the earliest written record of referring to this concept that we call Europe, this idea of a Christian culture and civilization, people speaking different languages, people from different backgrounds, but in the main united by a common faith. Columbanus and also St. Gall, who left that monastery pretty much at the same time, travelled to Europe, travelled to different parts, buried in different parts, and just because they were saints didn't mean they always got on. And Columbanus and Gall had a spectacular falling out, and that was how they ended up going two different directions. Gall stayed in Switzerland. He's lucky enough to have a city, a region, and believe it or not, even a champagne named after him. So that's a dubious distinction to have, I think, for any saint, and I say that as a teetotaler, so I can't give any comment on the quality of that particular champagne, but it is one of the oddities that the people associate on the continent with St. Gall. So those two saints, greatly revered as sons of Bangor Abbey, but when we come back to Ireland, and particularly to this part of the world, and especially this parish, as I'm going to try maybe in some ways just emphasise this evening, the person that you in this parish should very much claim as one of your own is St. Lazaran. Now, his feast day is on October the 25th. That is probably a factoid I didn't know myself until I was starting to do some research. I'd certainly heard of him, but I didn't know his feast day, and I know very little else about him. But I discovered just a few things about him, and I think perhaps as part of your 150th birthday celebrations, it's good maybe to highlight this particular saint, your connections in this parish in particular with that saint, and also maybe to invite and encourage you to renew and to develop and explore that connection a little bit further. And I'll return to that suggestion a little bit later in my talk. St. Lazaran actually wasn't the only saint in his family. He also had two brothers, St. Gobnin and St. Graffon, a trio, a trinity of saints, also associated with yet another saint, St. Carthage, who is very much venerated in Lismore in County Waterford, where he founded a monastery. Of course, also those connections with St. Comgall, who founded the monastery. But those particular saints at the time of St. Lazaran, they also had travelled in different parts of Ireland, and it's also believed that they founded a monastery in what is now Spike Island off the coast of Cork. In more recent times, it had been a prison, and it is now basically a visitor site, but there's a different history and heritage that perhaps in that island still has to be explored and also to be developed. I also, in the course then of my research, came across just a single reference, quite an old book. It's entitled The Face of Ulster, produced by an author called Dennis O. D. Hanna. It's an unusual way he lays out his name, O, then the D, and then the Hanna. He mentions, and he's the only reference that I found to this, that he believes that St. Lazaran, as well as spending time in different monasteries in Ireland, also had spent some time in the city of Rome during the papacy of Pope Gregory the Great, and he was Pope between 590 and 604. Now, I haven't been able to explore any further whether that particular story is true, but I have to say this evening, I sincerely hope it is true for several reasons, because Pope Gregory the Great, in fact, is actually one of my favourite popes, and he's certainly one of the popes, and indeed one of the people from history that I would most like to meet. And now, Stephen, I don't know whether you also know this particular detail, which I love about Gregory the Great. I think he's a good friend of priests for one particular reason. Did you know that Pope Gregory the Great had gout? No? Well, thank God Pope Gregory the Great had gout, because he found it very difficult to stand for a long time at the beginning of Mass because of the gout, and he simplified the liturgy. He said, instead of having a big, long penitential litany, we'll just have a short series of invocations, Lord of mercy, Christ of mercy, retaining, in fact, the last little bit of Greek, as it still would have been at that time, the Kyrie eleison and the Christe eleison. He also put the Our Father in its present position in the Mass, and again, it's a further reminder how some little incidental details and events and personalities from history, how in many unknown and simple and practical ways, their influence can still cast a very long shadow. So every year in the Pope Gregory the Great, I always like to share that little factoid with parishioners about how the papal gout actually simplified the Mass and gave a little bit less standing at the beginning. Now, when Lazarin was in Rome, according to Hannah, he says that Gregory the Great gave him a copy of the Scriptures. Again, I hope that story is actually true. It'd be a lovely connection. The only thing is, we don't know where or indeed when that book of Scriptures actually disappeared. Now, that's one papal collection then that you have through St. Lazarin, and there is another one that St. Lazarin further developed. We do know for a fact that he was part of a group of clergy, some bishops and some priests, who wrote to the Pope at the time, Pope Severinus, who had a very short papacy of 2 years, 638 to 640. And one of the big concerns at that time in the 7th century was trying to regulate and get some uniformity in the observation of the date of Easter. There had, as you probably might be aware, there was a clash between two different systems, between the Roman and the Celtic system. That really wasn't definitively resolved until the famous Synod of Whitby in the year 664. And you still have St. Hilda's Abbey on the cliff overlooking the North Sea and the east coast of England. It also actually unusually is another odd connection with Ireland, because it was in Whitby Bay, and that very, very dramatic ruined silhouette of the Abbey apparently served as an inspiration for Bram Stoker when he was conceiving Dracula. Now, I don't know, whether that is true, but it's a very popular urban myth, I know, in Whitby, and I did visit the town some years ago for the ordination of a classmate. Now, Lazarin was one of those who wrote to the Pope, and we do know that Lazarin very much favoured the Roman system over the Celtic system. And around about the time he was writing that letter to the Pope, he was busy in an even more important way for this particular parish, because not round about the year 640, that's when Lazarin established at the far end of the town his church, monastery, and a school. It also struck me that when you think of that school going back to the 7th century, that really was the foundation of a very long, distinguished educational tradition in this small-sized town, going back again over 1,500 years. And you think schools have come and gone across the centuries, but the present body of schools, mainly 19th, 20th and 21st century schools, a little bit like the site itself, each of those schools, irrespective of which tradition they are representing, I think collectively, all of the schools in this town can lay some collective claim on that rich and long history of education and teaching and the imparting and the sharing of knowledge in this town of Holywood. They may not go back to the 6th or 7th century, but they're certainly building on foundations that were laid not only with that first church, but indeed with that first, probably quite informal school. Now, sadly, nothing remains of those 7th century buildings that would be associated with St. Lazarin, the old priory church, that the ruins of which, of course, are still standing in the far end of the town with the little cemetery beside it. And this little priory that lived very much probably in the shadow of its mother house and its big sister further along the loch down at Bangor Abbey, it probably just continued on then for many centuries after St. Lazarin, basically doing what any monastery across Europe was doing then and has done in the century since. The monks lived together, they ate together, they worked, they prayed. That same pattern of prayer, study, and recreation that was a feature of the Celtic monasteries and features in the monasteries of the 21st century as well. The very same things come right back to the origins of monasticism, to St. Anthony of Egypt in the desert in North Africa. That is a tradition that has been shared and passed on with all the countries in the world on that very, very same model: prayer, work, and recreation. So that tradition of prayer just seems to have gone on just very, very quietly across the centuries until the rather dramatic times with the arrival of the Normans, bringing, of course, in their wake both disruption and change. The Anglo-Normans really weren't terribly interested in what they found in the indigenous remains of the Celtic Church. They weren't particularly interested even in our Celtic saints or our customs or traditions. They brought their own saints and some rather exotic names They also brought a little bit more order to monastic life in Ireland at the time. Basically, before the Normans, many monasteries, there would have been a broad commonality in the rules, but a lot of monasteries followed their own individual rules. But with the Normans comes uniformity. You find them introducing older religious orders from the continent, like the Benedictines, in time the Cistercians, who were a reform of the Benedictines, associated again with St. Malachy, who is the patron saint of this diocese, and another connection that we in this diocese again can be very proud, always reminding ourselves, certainly as Bishop Traynor liked to do, of the wider European connections and associations that we not only have in Ireland, but I think very particularly here in this diocese of Down and Connor. The Normans brought that system not only to the monasteries, but it was very much also in their wake with the synods in the 12th century that the diocesan system, which is much more common in the rest of Europe, was finally introduced. And oddly then, we probably have still to this day some of the oldest surviving diocesan boundaries in Europe, others in the continent, largely as a result of Napoleon. And there was a postgrad when I was a student in Rome, often liked to speculate, and sometimes I think he wished Napoleon had actually come to Ireland, and he used to say, if Napoleon had come to Ireland, I wonder, what shape the church should be in today, which diocese would we still have? And he thought we had too many, and probably we had, with 26 for such a small Catholic population. But nonetheless, we do have very, very old boundaries, and I suppose we have to be careful. There have to be some modifications, and there have been some possible mergers on the cards. But we don't want to discard all of that history either, and I think we should also be very proud of those very, very old diocesan boundaries that we still have. Our own diocese of Down and Connor was united in 1453, a very historic year, the fall of Constantinople. So even together as two dioceses, probably one of the early mergers, we still have a very, very long history, even if you just simply take it from the 15th century alone. One of the other great revolutions, of course, that the Normans brought with them was a different style of architecture. And so keen were they in this style of architecture, and so keen to eradicate things of the past. They sacked and they burned so many of the churches and the monasteries that they discovered here, but equally then took a chance to rebuild them in their own distinctive Anglo-Norman or Romanesque style, characterised with quite solid masonry, simple round-headed arches, some beautiful designs with chevrons, and in some way we have a slight echo of that chevron Romanesque design here in the ceiling of the church. That's probably more an accidental connection, and it's probably my rather vivid imagination at times running a little bit riot maybe as well, when I sometimes see connections that perhaps maybe even the architects didn't realise or intend. But in the wake of that new style of architecture, it also was a new beginning for St. Lazaren's Priory, rebuilt, we think, round about the year 1200, and some fragments of that Anglo-Norman church still survive in the ruined church at the end of the town. A few of the window fragments in particular are generally believed to exist from round about the 13th century. It's also towards the end of the 13th century that we get yet another papal connection with this parish and community. But this time the connection is not something that any of us particularly like ever to contemplate: the issue of tax. this case, it was a papal taxation associated with Pope Nicholas IV, who was Pope between 1288 and 1292. Again, a rather short papacy. He was the first Franciscan ever to become a pope, and despite his own poverty, he initiated this European-wide collection, a tax basically, on the religious houses and the monasteries of Europe, and they were very extensive and very thorough in that administration. Took years to compile, and it seemed to be probably around about the year 1300 before they got as far as this particular part of Ireland. The texts from the time record a spelling of the town as more like Holywood, a slightly different spelling, H-A-L-I-W-O-D-E, Holywood. Probably you can see the Norman connections probably coming into that name of the town. And the papal taxation from that time was valued at 6 marks, and I tried through Dr. Google to see if I could get some sort of calculation, and I think possibly those 6 marks in 1300 might be a relatively modest sum of £4,500, which maybe doesn't sound excessive for taxation. But when you think of how many houses, monasteries and convents there were in Europe at the time, and you add all that up, if you're getting at least 4,500 from each one of those, you can see it was definitely worth Pope Nicholas's time to have that taxation. And also, thanks to that, it does give a further written record of the existence of a church and a faith community in the town. Next significant development in the history of the town, probably again, like I've already done, quite a big jump of centuries when probably things got fairly well established with this new patron and the new concepts and designs that the Anglo-Normans had introduced. Takes us basically to the beginning of the 16th century, that very turbulent century in Irish and indeed European history. And the century begins just very neatly for this community in the year 1500, when the Franciscans, who came to Ireland just shortly after the death of St. Francis, were well established, not only in Ireland, but particularly throughout County Down and indeed the rest of the diocese. They finally came to Holywood, and they were assigned the custodianship of the priory here in the town. Now, unfortunately, that custodianship, because of the Reformation, was a very short period of time. And in 1541, the last of the local Irish priors, Conachar O'Hamel, was compelled to resign his guardianship, as the Franciscans would have called it, of the community. Its lands and everything then was taken on board by the agents of King Henry VIII. That left the Catholic community here in the town without a church, or indeed probably anything that resembled a congregation. And in fact, it nearly takes us then to the 18th century until we start getting some written record and evidence of a Catholic presence back in the town. And I mentioned Walter Harris in that little timeline that I did for the booklet for the Sesquicentennial Mass. And Walter Harris, in his Ancient and Present State of County Down, records that there was only one reputed papist living in the town. And maybe even wanted to qualify that even by just using the word reputed. He didn't maybe want to completely nail his colours definitively to the Mass, but by the 18th century, only one reputed papist or Catholic living in the town. 20 years later, in another survey, it's gone up to 7. So a rather modest increase. But in the meantime, one of the things that had changed was that the repaired and ruined church had been restored and brought back into use. Interestingly, when it was brought back into use, it was a shared building between Anglicans, King's religion, and also with dissenters with the Scottish planter tradition as well. Both of them, it seems, used that building, obviously, for separate services, until they both abandoned the church around about the year 1844, and then the present Anglican and Presbyterian congregations established their own separate buildings, and sadly, as a result of the priory being abandoned, it then fell into ruin, but it's still standing in some decayed form, and the cemetery is still there beside it, and even in that decayed form, it's still very much a living visual testimony and witness and a connection with the past. By the time we enter the 19th century, and even before Catholic emancipation in 1829, it has to be acknowledged that for most of the 18th and certainly well into the early 19th century, the more rigorous application of the penal laws had finally been relaxed. We know, for example, in St Mary's in Chapel Lane, the first church opened there in 1783, though there had been a rather discreet and very modest mass house, as it was called, hidden in behind the buildings, and that was how the Catholic community in the city centre certainly went to Mass. And I was just talking about this particular issue. I'm going off on another little tangent here. I was the Reverend Steve Stockman from Fitzroy Presbyterian. We were talking about the presence of the different churches and denominations in the city and how they'd moved and grown over the years. And he was rather intrigued to know that the first St Mary's was the original connection with Chapel Lane was actually older even than the first church, which has a very strong connection with the Presbyterian community, who were very generous supporters and benefactors of the church when St Mary's first opened in 1783. This led on to another odd conversation about early Catholic chapels in the 18th century before the penal laws were repealed, and back to our Franciscan friends in Dublin. They had a mass house down just on the side of the Merchant's Quay in Dublin. You might know the church is a beautiful big green copper dome almost facing the forecourts. Now, what you see today isn't obviously what was there in the 18th century. The Franciscans had a very modest mass house located in behind other buildings, and the way you got into that mass house was going through a pub. And rather oddly, and it was an odd name for a pub, it has to be said, that pub was called Adam and Eve's. And you had to go through Adam and Eve's pub, and I think it was nearly like a secret sign, are you going to Adam and Eve's? Which really meant you were going to Mass. Now, I'm sure some of the punters going into Mass probably got lost in the pub on the way out, and some others when they were coming home. But to this day, when the Franciscans, as penal laws were relaxed and things changed, and they were able to acquire more property, and they bought over the pub and the adjacent buildings, and they built a very fine church they currently have there today, the old name, Adam and Eve's, is still stuck. And the side entrance into that, it's built parallel to the River Liffey, and the side entrance into that church is pretty much on the site of Adam and Eve's pub. I think the church is dedicated to St Francis, but it's colloquially called Adam and Eve's. And I think these rich and odd factoids are part of our wonderful history, North and South, Catholic and Protestant, because we're all in this together, and it's such a wonderful exotic history. And those simple little stories like that, and particularly those early instances of what we today call ecumenism, and we can rejoice in those good relations that very, very much existed, particularly as the 18th century went on, and just to see that practical help and support the denominations gave to one another in those early days. And we can, again, in this diocese, be very, very proud of how the Presbyterian community in particular gave such consistent and practical support to a very, very small community of Catholics in Belfast. Probably slightly bigger, obviously, than what was here in Holywood, as I mentioned. Number crept up to 7. So Catholic emancipation, of course, comes along in 1829, and that, of course, was one of the great defining moments in the modern history, not only of the Irish Church, but indeed of the Irish nation. But before the penal laws were actually formally repealed, as I've indicated, things were thankfully very considerably relaxed, and so much so that those mass houses were being constructed, some rather modest churches. And in 1811, the Bishop of the diocese, Bishop McMullen, appointed a resident priest for this district, a man called Fr Patrick Curran. He was already resident along the Ards, but he also rather unusually was tutor to the Marquess of Londonderry. A rather unusual thing, again, an indication of cooperation across traditions. The Londonderrys would have been Anglican, Church of Ireland, and was a local Catholic priest, probably maybe through his knowledge of Latin and Greek that he would learnt in the seminary when he was a student. He clearly had some input, and so he knew this district and this part of the world, and maybe that's why Bishop McMullen appointed Father Curran to become a resident priest for this district. Father Curran was very proactive and established really then what you might call something resembling a church in a house belonging to Mrs. Connor in Mill Street. It's now, I think, called Riverstone Terrace, is built on the site here in the town today. It was really just little more probably than a converted room somewhere, probably maybe in outbuildings. It wasn't daily mass, it wasn't even weekly mass, apart from during the summer months, it just seems, because of the distance that Father Curran had to cover just getting from one mass station to another, and possibly indeed, I'm sure, some of the mass rocks that were still in use for some time, even though the penal laws, the application was relaxed. Father Curran just tended to come and say mass here in Holywood in the better weather on Sundays, and saved himself the longer journey from Newtownards, where he was pretty much resident, and came to Holywood in the summer months. But in the other seasons of the year, both he and his immediate successors used a home about halfway between Newtownards and Holywood, a man called Jeremiah Lockhart. He was a gardener attached to Ballymeenock House, and it was there that Father Curran found probably a little bit more convenient, not only, I'm sure, for himself, but also for that very small and scattered congregation that he found himself administering to. Within a few years, there was another new parish priest, 1822, a Father Arthur McGlynn, and he also formed a congregation in Donaghadee, and also then began in earnest the first attempt to build a proper church here in the town. And he initiated a collection, and on St. Patrick's Day, 1829, the newly appointed, or recently appointed Bishop, Bishop Crowley, laid the foundation stone for that church. And there's a report in the Northern Whig which records, and again, I had included this in the Mass booklet, the Northern Whig says, at that particular foundation stone ceremony, a large assembly of persons was present, of different denominations, and a feeling of liberality, kindness, and cordiality was manifested. That could have been the opening of this present church in 1995 as well. I was present at that, and what a wonderful day it was. Again, it was a shared sense of celebration, not only for the Catholic community, but for all the denominations in the town that were so well represented, and again, had so generously supported the construction or the reconstruction of the church following the fire in 89. But that year, 1829, when that first foundation stone was laid of a permanent church presence here in the town, of course, was indeed that all-important year of Catholic emancipation. And on the 13th of April of 1829, that was the actual date that Catholic emancipation became law. And that church that was built in that historic year, by 1830, it seems to have been in use. And then on the 13th of March, 1831, Bishop Crowley was back in the town, and he blessed and formally dedicated that church. He also took the chance to conduct a census. Seems to be a bit of obsession in this town with senior clergy, whether it's counting people or trying to raise tax. So don't be telling Bishop McGlynn too much of what's going on here. Just keep it to yourselves. But Bishop Crowley discovered that there were 81 parishioners in the town, so quite a substantial increase from the 7. But by 1871, jumping ahead a few decades, census records, and this time it was a civil census rather than a diocesan or a church one. By 1871, there were 1,210 Catholics in the town, so that was quite an increase from 1831, when there were 81, to 1,200 in 40 years' time. 1831, the first, what you might call, permanent church really in this town was blessed and opened. Also nearby in St Matthew's in Ballymacarrett, the original St Matthew's was built, and it was replaced by the present structure in 1883. And in fact, that original building that opened in 1831 survived just up until basically last year. It had long since been converted into a hall. It had got a bit dilapidated, and unfortunately it was much altered, obviously, across the decades, and it was only demolished last year, and it would have probably been the oldest standing Catholic structure in the city. Probably St Malachy's, where I'm currently based, which opened in 1844, could now take that accolade. It may be the third church built, but it's currently the oldest standing, because St Mary's and St Patrick's, which predates St Malachy's, were rebuilt like so many churches in the course of the 19th century, and that, as you can see, was the pattern that emerged also here in Holywood. We also got a new parish priest round about that time, a Father Anthony Cossett. Sadly, he left the diocese, went to work in Glasgow, and died in 1854 in the workhouse in Liverpool. I'm not sure what the circumstances, whether he himself maybe had fallen in hard times, whether he was chaplain there, but that is where he is recorded in a list of the priests of the diocese. That fantastic volume that was produced with extracts from O'Laverty's history and compiled by Father Fullen, who had been in Bangor in the 1950s, and was further augmented by the late Monsignor Macaulay and also by Canon O'Hanlon, the diocesan archivist. And that's the detail that they were able to find. Not much more, but we do know that sadly one of your former parish priests died in 1854 away from home and died in the workhouse. Now, the really big year is 1866, almost 160 years ago, because it is really from that date then that this parish and community takes on a distinctive, separate identity from its neighbours in Newtownards, and particularly from Ballymacarrat, where the parish had largely been administered. As Ballymacarrat was closer to the city, it was probably a more convenient place for the parish priest to live. Numbers were increasing, as we can see, that steady climb from that 81 in 1831 to the 1200 in 1871. So the bishop decided at the time that he would separate Holywood from Ballymacarrat. Father O'Laverty, and I have this beautiful picture. It's sort of come full circle. Father Stephen gave this to the bishop, and the bishop gave it to me to put in the archives, but I thought I should bring it along here this evening to just remind you what your most distinguished parish priest, of course, apart from your own current parish priest, that is, your most distinguished historic parish priest, shall we leave it at that, Monsignor O'Laverty, let you know what he looked like a little bit later in life. There's some nice photographs of him as a younger man, but this fine portrait of him here depicts him in later life, by the time he became a Monsignor in 1904. He was a very distinguished, a very accomplished man, as you can see from some of the other historical notes around the church, and as well as obviously being a very committed pastor, he was also a very, very distinguished historian. And one of his great interests seemed to have been our secondary patron of Ireland, St Colmcille. And he went on a parish pilgrimage to the island of Iona, where Colmcille made his last and most famous foundation, in which they placed that he's still probably associated even more than his home country and his home county of Garshin up in County Donegal. But when he was on that pilgrimage, a bit like maybe Gibbon when he was inspired to write his history of the Roman Empire, something moved the spirit and elevated the mind. And when he was on that particular pilgrimage on Iona in St Colmcille's monastery, it was there that he decided that he would like to build a proper church for the town, and that it would be dedicated to St Colmcille. We know he had some pilgrims with him on that occasion. I like to think, as I'm sure you probably like to think yourselves, that probably there were some of your forebears from the parish that accompanied him on that particular pilgrim. And when he had that particular light bulb moment and declared what he was going to do and who he was going to dedicate the church to, we are told when he made that declaration, he was hailed with applause. So clearly a very welcome decision, and one that he had made far from home. And it is a decision and a consequence that we very much live with here today, with the 150 years history that you're now currently celebrating. So having decided to build a church, he did what was quite common in the 19th century and decided to have an architectural competition, but really kind of in tandem with that, and you probably know a little bit more of the story, there was also, you could say, a parallel competition going on for a site. There were a lot of machinations going on in the background. The feeling seems to be that O'Laverty wanted this elevated site on the edge of town. It wasn't in the centre, but it was an elevated site, and he knew that whatever church he would build in this site could be more easily seen from all approaches by land and by Belfast Lough. But to get the site that he particularly wanted, he had to pretend he wanted to go somewhere else, and apparently plans certainly were drawn up for a much larger, a much more elaborate church to be beside another church in the centre of the town, when it was sort of gently suggested perhaps maybe he would go for this site instead. And really, this was the site that I think he always wanted. So he was probably a clever old fox, and he knew a lot about human nature. But anyway, it's the facts and the fiction again, but that seems to be the general consensus, that there were a little bit of skullduggery and all sorts of things going on in the background. But O'Laverty got his will, and he got the site anyway that he wanted. Built a more modest church than those initial plans, probably also realised that the other one would have been too expensive. It was a much more modest building, and in fact, even when it was open in 1874, the building was incomplete, so that would certainly suggest that even before any foundation stone was laid, he had to be realistic in cutting back and scaling back his intentions and plans. Having said that, the person that he got to design that church as a winner of the competition, a young man called Timothy Heavey, born in 1846. I also discovered another useless little piece of information, that Heavey actually died in Alfred Street, number 4, and I live in 24, so just down the street from where I'm currently living. The architect of this church unfortunately died a very young man. Now, he was very, very talented and very skilled, and he had actually trained in a very distinguished architectural partnership, Pugin and Ashland, not Pugin Senior, who would probably be one of my greatest architectural heroes, but his son, Edward Welby Pugin, who had married an Irish woman, George Coppinger Ashland's daughter, and the two men then together formed an architectural partnership, and they certainly were one of the leading partnerships in the country at the time. And Heavey, as a young man, worked with them, was trained by them, and probably would have been very much inspired by some of the texts that would have been there by Pugin the Elder. Just have some little copies of those. The Floriated Ornament and the Glossary of Ecclesiastical Ornament that Pugin's father had written. He also was a very extensive author, Pugin's, as well as an illustrator and an architect. He produced many, many volumes on architectural theory, consequences of which some would say are still having an impact today, because he regarded ornamentation should only be an essential enrichment of the fabric. It shouldn't be superfluous. It should be a simple adding to what, an enrichment of what is actually there, but not just putting ornament on for the sake of it. So, in that very influential partnership, Timothy Heavey cut his bones, but eventually ended up working up north. Got the commission for this particular church. You might also be interested to know he designed the entrance gates to Milltown Cemetery. Also worked quite a bit in Donegal, designed the Church of the Sacred Heart in Dunlewy, very popular weddings for our venue for weddings in Donegal. And also, just to show that he wasn't a one-trick pony, he designed the Bank of Ireland in the main street in Letterkenny. It's always good to diversify just a little bit as well. Well, anyway, Father O'Laverty had got his architect, he had got his site. He certainly knew which saint he wanted to dedicate it to. That was St Colmcille. And to keep up those particular connections with Colmcille, he thought the best thing to do would bring a stone from Garshin in Donegal, and that was to be the foundation stone taken from St Colmcille's birth. He died in 521, and then on June the 28th, 1872, that foundation stone was laid. And as we recall, particularly on the very date itself, just a few months ago, on June the 14th, 1874, Bishop Dorian, the then Bishop of the diocese, came and blessed that church that O'Laverty had hoped for and planned and prayed for. He brought in a very distinguished Dominican, Fr Thomas McGlynn, who was one of the leading preachers in Ireland at the time. The building, though, as I mentioned, wasn't actually finished at that stage, and it wasn't until 1889 to 1891, a 2-year project to build the tower and also to build the spire. Obviously, additional funds were needed. A different architect by this time comes on board, Mortimer Thompson, who had worked with the original architect and obviously just continued on so much of his practice after his death. And of course, the bell was installed at that time from the very famous John Taylor's bell foundry in Loughborough, which is still in existence to this day. Although Loughborough, I think, probably for younger people today, doesn't really come to mind as a factory for bells. I don't know if any of you have ever had your family go to Loughborough. It has a very, very famous university for sports. It is kind of, Loughborough University, I believe, is like the Oxford, Cambridge for sports studies. But before it was famous for sports, it was, and it still remains famous for bells. And again, here in this parish, you have one of those bells from that very, very famous and celebrated bell foundry. The church on the inside was probably a little bit sparse in the early days, and those Pugin ornamental books probably helped serve for some inspiration for the rather, and I am not joking here, entitled Mr. Bean. And I am not joking, but there was a Mr. Bean from London who was working in Craigavad House round about the time Father O'Laverty was wanting to decorate the interior of the church. And as any of the surviving black and white photographs show us, it was very, very richly decorated on the inside. Given the fact it was dedicated to a Celtic saint and O'Laverty's great love of Irish history, they took a lot of Celtic motifs, which apparently were inspired, possibly, yes, by those books of Pugin, which almost every architect at the time would have known. But they also took a very particular volume, George Petry's works, and he was a very distinguished archaeologist of Irish architecture and monastic sites, had produced some beautiful illustrations. He wasn't related, I don't think, to the more famous Flinders Petry, who was associated with Egyptian archaeology also in the 19th century, but George Petry was a member of the Royal Hibernian Academy, and so many of his illustrations apparently served as an inspiration for the very, very lavish interior decoration that the church had. One of the other things that O'Laverty, again with his great sense of history, had written round the walls, text of the Sancti Venite, which is, in fact, the oldest surviving hymn in honour of the Blessed Eucharist. And it has a connection again with this diocese in this region. The Sancti Venite was written in Bangor Abbey. The antiphonary in which it was recorded is now sadly in the Ambrosian Library in Milan. Like so many of our great manuscripts are found all over Europe. We have a handful, of course, the Book of Kells, the Book of Durrow, a few of those very famous ones in Dublin, but so many of our most important treasures from that golden era of the Celtic Church are in different libraries, and the Sancti Venite is a text that has been sung for centuries, and it is also one of the prized possessions in the Ambrosian Library, still to this very day, the Bangor Antiphonary, a book associated with the town on the shores of Belfast Lough and one of the greatest and famous libraries in Europe. Around about the time that decoration was done to the inside of the church, the first organ was put in the church. It actually had been acquired from what is now St. Peter's Cathedral. They had a smaller organ that was deemed to be too small for the size of the church, and it was just a very happy fault at the time as they were taking it out. It was the time that Father O'Laverty was ready to put one with that ongoing, put one here in the church with those ongoing renovations. As I've already alluded, the black and white photographs, which are scattered around the church, do go and take a look at those and inspect them in great detail. And even those old photographs in black and white, I think you'll agree with me, they really are a feast for the eyes. The detail in the carved stone of the original high altar, the side chapel, the baptismal font, the detail even of the pews. You can see the lavish stencil decoration that was on all of the walls in the church, but particularly, obviously, very much concentrated on the arch above the sanctuary and in the sanctuary itself. And most of that rich stenciling decoration survived pretty much into the 20th century. And then we come to the 1960s, the Second Vatican Council, time of change in the church, and some of those changes, if you ask me, weren't always entirely successful and certainly not always sensitive. And St. Colmcille underwent a very dramatic reordering in 1969 under the direction of McCusker, Power and Leeson. And in fact, that church was probably one of the very first churches at the time to undergo a permanent reordering Churches had experimented with freestanding tables and altars, but the parish priest at the time was probably, some would say, courageous to go for something so permanent. A time in the liturgy and those early reforms, it was still a time of transition, but he really just bit the bullet and sadly took everything out of the church. And when you look at the change from the 19th century decoration to what happened in 1969 to accommodate the liturgical reforms, well, I think you can't but lament so much that was lost in that church, and indeed so many other churches in the 60s and the 70s. The church would have lost so much of its drama, and I think so much of its beauty in its interior, when all that beautiful stenciling and gorgeous carving in the sanctuary, when all those things sadly were eliminated. And sadly, of course, as we know, even though those things were eliminated, not only the original furnishings are gone, but indeed the original church itself. And even though that church that burnt down in 1989 was very different from what O'Lavery had conceived and would have known during his time as parish priest, and indeed his successors, and it was indeed a very, very fine Gothic revival church, both outside and inside. It was a great loss, of course, when that church burnt down in that awful fire just over 35 years ago. The church, of course, for any community, represents so much of the focus of parish and indeed also social life. It was a place where many of you would have come, of course, for Mass, for sacraments, for yourselves, other past generations of your families. But there was also something that happened here in the church, and that was on the feasts in Colmcille, the 9th of June, 1879, when O'Lavery, with his great love of and his great sense of history, celebrated the 1300th anniversary of the death of St Colmcille. And for that particular occasion, he produced this little modest pamphlet. And it says here on the front, an account of the ceremonies of the celebration of the 13th century of the death of St Colmcille, held on the 9th of June 1897 in the Parish Church of Holywood, dedicated under the invocation of St Colmcille. Now obviously that little volume is much more modest compared to these much heavier tomes that I have here behind me that some of you maybe do have at home. O'Lavery's celebrated 5-volume history of the Diocese of Down and Connor, 4 volumes on the history, a 5th volume which was dedicated to the bishops of the diocese. I treasure that set that I have there, so much so I got them boxed up, and I even keep them sitting on that beautiful little bookrest. And beside it, there's an extraction from that on O'Lavery's life of St Malachy as the principal patron of the diocese. And that 5-volume history of the diocese is still, even to this day, well over a century after it was written, and it took quite a while, volume by volume, to produce that particular work. It is still regarded pretty much as authoritative, a classic of local history, particularly ecclesiastical history, and it is certainly probably for any priest in this diocese who wants to know anything about his parish, that still would be the starting point for most priests, and certainly for most church historians, and it will always lead on to further research. O'Lavery, having begun the process, will always help lead you on in different directions and through different channels. Along with those volumes, of course, he produced many other articles and wrote in all the leading periodicals at the time. And in recognition of that very considerable scholarship and also his wide knowledge as well, he was gifted with a membership of the Royal Irish Academy, elected by his scholarly peers. And I think he's only one of 2 priests in this diocese who have ever enjoyed that particular accolade. The other was a little bit more recently. Father James McAvoy, who taught scholastic philosophy at Queen's, also taught in Louvain, and also, before his death, was teaching in St Patrick's College, Maynooth. So that was a very particular recognition of O'Lavery's contribution, not only just to wider church life, but indeed to the wider world of academia as well, through that membership of the Royal Irish Academy. Thankfully, we still have those works today, which are cherished. But sadly, of course, as I've just mentioned, we don't have O'Lavery's beautiful church. But as I was gathering my thoughts for this particular presentation here this evening, I thought another sort of angle that, yes, while it was sad that this church that he built was lost through a fire, no one ever welcomes the destruction of a church, and particularly when it's such an irreparable loss as happened in 1989, where it was beyond repair. But I also sort of thought, well, O'Lavery was a historian, and the destruction of that church, however unwelcome and painful at the time, was, if you think about it, just one little part in the long, complex cycle of loss and destruction, as well as renewal and rebirth. Things die, something else comes along. The old gives way to the new, and so that's what happened when it was realised O'Lavery's church couldn't be retrieved or retained, and yet again another architectural competition. The design was won by Rooney and McConville, who very much did specialise in church design and refurbishment, and the design that they won was commenced in 1993, and as I mentioned, on the 28th of May, I, like many of you here, was present for the dedication of this present, equally majestic but in a different way, the church that's standing on the site today, that was blessed and dedicated by our recently deceased other former bishop, Bishop Patrick Walsh. Now, obviously, you wouldn't have to have any great understanding or appreciation of architecture to compare and contrast these two buildings. This certainly is a different church for a different time. A centrally planned church, so different from the more conventional rectangular shape of the old church, centrally placed, and even a circular altar. It's all quite logical in this building in a different way, and in many ways I think it's like a miniature version of Liverpool Cathedral, which was considered a very radical building, particularly for a cathedral, and on a much more modest scale. Some parish churches, we already had one circular church in the diocese before this. That would have been in Newcastle, and also just shortly before this church opened, the church in Deloy, not dissimilar in many respects to the floor plan of this church, and there are others, of course, around the country. The very famous one, St Angus and Burt, designed by Liam McCormick, just overlooking Lough Swilly, was designated actually by Liam McCormick's peers as the Irish building of the 20th century. So also having a circular church here, you could say you are up with the best of them, with Liverpool Cathedral, and also with the Irish building of the 20th century. But while this different floor plan was something of the new, there's also for all that something of the old. In fact, something very, very ancient. And that is the ceiling that I've already mentioned, constructed out of cedar wood, which, as we know from the Bible, this was the very timber that King David had collected amongst other materials and entrusted to his son Solomon, who he was told in a dream was to be the person who was to build the first temple in Jerusalem. And the inside of the Holy of Holies was lined with Lebanese cedar. And of course, when we think of Lebanon today, we probably don't think of cedar wood, and perhaps maybe any time you look up at that ceiling, maybe when you come in to say a prayer, particularly pray for the people, not only of Lebanon, but all war-torn regions. This is one of their finest products, Lebanese cedar, a very beautiful wood, a very enduring wood as well, and it was considered so special and so precious that it was the timber that lined the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant reposed in the temple in Jerusalem. And even traditionally, tabernacles of churches in the past used to be on a much more modest scale, lined with cedar wood inside the metal surround and the stone or marble that further encased that. But the inside of tabernacles was quite often lined with cedar wood. So having a cedar wood ceiling here also is a link with an even more ancient custom and practice. And of course, there are some very visible links to the old church on the outside. You have the stone, which was able to be retained to case the outer walls. The tower and the spire, thankfully, are still retained and providing that wonderful landmark coming in any direction of Holywood, and even on a very clear day, you can see it on the far side of Belfast Lough when you're coming down the M2. And also, as I reflected again on this building, while yes, very different from its Victorian predecessor, not stencilled in the conventional way that a Victorian Gothic building would have been, but this also is a building that is equally rich in colour. Not stencilled walls, but particularly in the stained glass, and also the beautiful mosaics and some of the other works of art that were put in this church at the time of the opening. And I know that you have been further embellishing the church over the 30 years since it opened in 1995. Now, this is where I return to St. Lazarin. And I'm maybe going to make a little suggestion for you today. Father Stephen's waving his hand. He's saying, is this going to involve money? Yes, it probably will if you follow it through. In fact, there's no probably, it will. But here's just possibly a little suggestion on the 150th anniversary, both of your original church and next year to celebrate the 30th anniversary of this present church. Perhaps maybe in Our Lady's Chapel, you could revive an old connection with the saint that you in this parish, above all other parishes in the diocese, can call your own, St. Lazarin, and to try and renew that connection. O'Lavery tried to do it in one particular way with St. Lazarin's Academy, one of those schools that came and went over the long passage of time. But in this little booklet that I mentioned, O'Lavery states this towards the end. And this is just maybe to stimulate your thoughts. He writes, in the chapel of the Blessed Virgin Mary in the church of St. Colmcille, there is a very interesting monument. It reminds the people of Holywood that more than 12 and a half centuries ago, their predecessors in the parish turned their hearts with filial affection towards Rome and humbly submitted their disputes to its decisions. The questions which then agitated the people of this country regarding the method of the calculating of the Sunday in which Easter should fall and the proper form that the tonsure of a monk should assume. Some bishops, abbots, among whom was Lazarin, the abbot of Holywood, petitioned the Holy See to decide the controversy. The monument is of a triptych form, the outer compartments of which are filled with old Spanish paintings representing St. Peter and St. Paul, life-sized. The middle compartment contains the following inscription: St. Peter and St. Paul, pray for us. In the year of our Lord 640, some Irish bishops and priests, one of whom was the Holy Lazarin, abbot of Ard of Ignasca, which was the original name for the town, and he says, which is now called Holywood, solicited Pope Severinus to pronounce his decision on some matters of controversy that had risen among them. And the ecclesiastical history written by Holy Bede, Book 2, Chapter 19, preserves the answer which they received from Rome. This monument is intended to commemorate the filial piety and practical obedience by which our predecessors in this parish reverenced of old the decrees of the successor of St. Peter, to whom was commanded, feed my lambs, feed my sheep. John chapter 21. Feed my lambs, feed my sheep. That has been the task of every Christian, priest, bishop, layman or woman, who has prayed in and on this sacred site for the past 150 years. In this building and its predecessor, where they have come to find spiritual renewal and support and to construct a living family of faith. That story is one, as you can see, of life and death, of beginnings and endings, of loss, and indeed sometimes an unwilling let go. And perhaps maybe at this point also could recall the fact that for 30 years the parish once had a second church, Christ the King, at Sydenham. And compared with the history of this parish on this site, and indeed the longer history of the parish, it hadn't survived too long, but I know there are still people today who lament its loss. That building, while it was here, was enjoyed, but is gone. All of those things, I think, remind us that more changes, sadly, are ahead of all of us as a Catholic community. And very soon we will mark the second centenary of Catholic emancipation, which will be commemorated in 2029. I think in the years following the commemoration of that second centenary of Catholic emancipation, we will see something of the past. And it actually be revealed in a slightly unusual way. It will see probably the boundaries of this parish faith community once again looking closer to what your ancestors knew from the structures we all know today. That is just simply a fact. It's not to alarm or to distress. It's a reminder we've been there before, here we are again. What lies ahead is definitely unknown. It's the final, unwritten, and indeed will always be an incomplete chapter in the long history of this church, this parish, and community. However, or wherever you decide to plot that line, was it when this church opened in 95, its predecessor in 1874, or if you take yourselves back over the 1,500 years of that living Christian presence in and around this town. In 50 years' time, someone will possibly do what you and I are doing this evening. They will commemorate not 150th, but the bicentenary of a church dedicated to St. Colmcille. And hopefully, in 50 years' time, there will still be a church dedicated to that saint and on this site. It's also a time for you as a faith community, as you move into the future, to reflect on that faith lived, received, and passed on across generations and centuries, through times of stress and trial and tribulation, times of letting go freely and unwillingly. But it is a history of which you, as a parish community, can be proud, and which you can confidently pass on to generations yet to come. St. Colmcille, pray for us. Thank you.
Father Thomas, thank you for a most interesting and informative evening. It makes me, as a kind of a blow into this parish, to feel very proud to be part of this tremendous history that you've told us about tonight. And long may we continue to keep all the sentiments you expressed there tonight as we go forward for the next 50 years. Yeah, thank you, Father.